This video is a continuation of my review of Dr. Stephen Flower's book, Lords of the Left-Hand Path. In Chapter 9 of this book, Flowers discusses the major doctrines of the Church of Satan, the church founded by Anton LaVey in 1966. The Satanic Bible is a collection of essays, observations, and rituals published by LaVey in 1969, and it is the central religious text of LaVeyan Satanism. Flowers deconstructs the 9 satanic statements that were first published in the Satanic Bible. These statements form the core philosophy of the church. Flowers does not specifically list the statements as he discusses them, but I verified them by checking the website of the Church of Satan. So I'll review the 9 statements first, and then I'll cover Flowers' analysis of each of the statements. 1. Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence. 2. Satan represents vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams. 3. Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. 4. Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it instead of love wasted on ingrates. 5. Satan represents vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. 6. Satan represents responsibility to the responsible instead of concern for psychic vampires. 7. Satan represents man as just another animal, sometimes better, more often worse than those that walk on all fours, who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all. 8. Satan represents all of the so-called sins, as they all lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. And 9. Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had, as he has kept it in business all these years. The first 6 of these statements illustrate the concept of antinomianism that Flowers presents in the introduction of his book. He defines antinomianism as practitioners going against the grain of culturally conditioned and conventional norms of good and evil. He says that true lords of the left-hand path are courageous enough to identify themselves with what the prevailing culture defines as evil. It is, however, important to stress that he also reminds the reader that the right-hand path and left-hand path are methods or approaches and not actual sects or groups in themselves. Now for his analysis of the statements. The first statement, Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence, is about an emphasis upon the fulfillment of desires as opposed to demonstrating restraint. LaVey sees natural indulgences as those that arise out of the individual's essential nature, which is human. This means that what Christianity sees as the 7 deadly sins, he sees as a potential catalyst for development of a practitioner's individuality. The catalyst, in turn, can lead to self-deification, or the attainment of the individual of an awakened state. Self-deification is the second criterion Flowers describes as necessary for an individual to be designated as a true lord or lady of the left-hand path. Flowers says that LaVey names the 7 deadly sins of Christianity as greed, pride, envy, anger, gluttony, lust, and sloth. In our modern age, however, these may be translated into ambition, self-respect, self-preservation, material or physical well-being, and pleasure of all kinds. Flowers argues that, in fact, these are the main driving forces behind our modern Western industrialized society, and therefore we are already living in a satanic age. The second statement, Satan represents vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams, relates to a focus upon the power of the physical body and physical existence. This is what is meant by the term vital existence. This means the emphasis is upon the here and now, the material world, as opposed to an ethereal spiritual world, which LaVey sees as nothing but an illusion. The third statement is Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. Dr. Flowers interprets this as being the satanic version of the famous oracle at Delphi's advice to know thyself, and ye shall know the universe and the gods. Knowing oneself leads to wisdom, which in turn leads the individual practitioner down the path of self-deification. The herd mentality is the opposite of this. It leads to consensus trance and the merging of the individual self into the collective group. This is seen as one of the 9 satanic sins. The 4th statement is, Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it instead of love wasted on ingrates. Flowers explains that LaVey is emphasizing the need for humans to accept that they will quite naturally love those they love and hate their enemies. He says there's no reason to pretend when it comes to this because love and hate are natural human emotions. While the Christian preacher might teach love your enemies, LaVey sees this as contradictory to human nature. The 5th statement is, Satan represents vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. Flowers says that the vengeance LaVey is talking about here is revenge taken through magical means, either through what he terms lesser magical psychological methods or a greater magical conjuration of destruction. However, he is not talking about human sacrifice, but the right of the individual to feel utter hatred for anyone or anything that has wronged them, and whereby true justice demands punishment. Flowers says this represents a socio-political statement in that it represents the triumph of individual sovereignty over the collectivist state justice system, which often fails in meting out true justice. I've listened to a lot of Jordan Maxwell lectures. Jordan, who recently passed away, used to say, "There is no justice, there's just us." I thought of this when I read Flowers' explanation of Statement 5. Statement 6 is, Satan represents responsibility to the responsible instead of concern for psychic vampires. I found this one very personally interesting because in my work as a Reiki energy master and psychic medium, I frequently run into people who I would classify as either energy vampires or people who have entities attached to them which are draining their energy. The core idea of this statement is that people who take more than they give in return are toxic and should be avoided. Statement 7 is, Satan represents man as just another animal, sometimes better, more often worse than those that walk on all fours, who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all. This refers to Anton LaVey's view of humans as just another animal, but with a caveat. Man possesses something that sets him apart, and that is his divine spiritual and intellectual development. This is what allows for humans to use their will to further their development, but LaVey concedes that this also means the potential exists for man to become vicious. Animals do not have this capacity, and this sets humans apart from them. Statement 8 is, Satan represents all of the so-called sins as they lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. Stephen Flowers says this statement is related to Statement 1 because it grants the practitioner license to indulge in all natural desires that the larger culture deems are sins. The collective group delineates these as sins, and thus they must be rejected by the practicing Satanist. The very fact that the collective rejects them is the reason that Satanists exalt them. The last statement is Statement 9. It is, Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had, as he has kept it in business all these years. The Hebraic term Satan means adversary, adversarial, the opponent. It is for this reason that the existence of the church depends on Satan, the adversary. This dual world is a world of opposites. Flowers interprets Statement 9 as meaning that in order for a right-hand belief system to exist, there must exist its opposite. There must always be an enemy, for without an enemy, there's no synthesis. For example, perhaps you've heard of the Hegelian dialectic. In this dialectic, the conflict of a thesis and antithesis produces synthesis, because out of conflict comes change and the birth of something new. Therefore, there must always be two sides in opposition to one another, or there can be no synthesis. Statement 9 is about the thesis, the church, and the antithesis, Satan, the adversary, in opposition to one another. Flowers says this is why Satan is in reality an ally of the church, because without Satan, there would be no enemy to fight. Dr. Flowers also comments on the 9 satanic sins, which were first published by the church in 1987 in issue 199 of the Cloven Hoof. The first sin is stupidity. LaVey says that Satanists must learn to see through the propaganda and delusion that the collective culture, especially through the mass media, uses to control them. The inability to see through the veil of deception and the propensity to do whatever they are told is the first satanic sin. The second sin is pretentiousness, especially if it leads one to become easily manipulated. The third sin is solipsism. Flowers says this is defined as the idea that only the self exists, and any world outside of it may be controlled by the will of the Satanist. Solipsism is the philosophical idea that only one's mind is sure to exist. Solipsism holds that knowledge of anything outside one's own mind is unsure. The external world and other minds cannot be known and might not exist outside the mind. Words that describe the opposite of solipsism are selflessness, self-sacrifice, and togetherness. The fourth sin is self-deceit. Flowers says this is basically a lack of self-awareness or self-knowledge. The fifth sin is herd conformity. The true Satanist always rejects what I call the consensus trance of the masses, because collectivism is the opposite of individual sovereignty. Flowers comments that the only time the Satanist practices submission to another is if by doing so it ultimately benefits the practitioner in the long run. The sixth sin is a lack of perspective. The true practitioner of LaVeyan Satanism realizes that all things must be seen in their proper context, because if they are not, this could lead to a jettison of individuality in favor of herd mentality. The seventh sin LaVey calls a forgetfulness of past orthodoxies. It is crucial that historical perspective always be acknowledged because it prevents the practitioner from falling for the false promises of what the standard population accepts as orthodoxy. The eighth sin is counterproductive pride. Though pride is a satanic virtue, if it gets in the way of the goals of the individual, it can contribute to his or her downfall. The final satanic sin is a lack of aesthetics. Aesthetics was very important to LaVey, and this is probably why it was considered one of the key concepts of the religion. LaVey was an artist, musician, and a painter. As Dr. Flowers points out, the etiology of the word aesthetics is the Greek word for the senses. Since indulgence in sensory stimulation is an important focus of LaVeyan Satanism, it is not surprising that LaVey encouraged its cultivation. In the final part of this video, I will cover Dr. Flowers' analysis of another important satanic law called the Lex Satanicus, or the 11 Rules of the Earth. This is stated as, do unto others as they do unto you. Included in this philosophy is the lex talionis, or law of the talon, or law of tooth and claw. This law is perhaps best understood in terms of the survival of the fittest. The 11 rules of the earth constitute the LaVeyan Code of Ethics, and I took these directly from the churchofsatan.com website. 1. Do not give opinions or advice unless you are asked. 2. Do not tell your troubles to others unless you are sure they want to hear them. 3. When in another's lair, show him respect, or else do not go there. 4. If a guest in your lair annoys you, treat him cruelly and without mercy. 5. Do not make sexual advances unless you are given the mating signal. 6. Do not take that which does not belong to you unless it is a burden to the other person and he cries out to be relieved. 7. Acknowledge the power of magic if you have employed it successfully to obtain your desires. If you deny the power of magic after have called upon it with success, you will lose all you have obtained. 8. Do not complain about anything to which you need not subject yourself. 9. Do not harm little children. 10. Do not kill non-human animals unless you are attacked or for your food. 11. When walking in open territory, bother no one. If someone bothers you, ask him to stop. If he does not stop, destroy him. Dr. Flowers recounts several quotes from LaVey. He says that in 1982, LaVey wrote, quote, Satanism is more than a philosophy. It is a lone stand, a symbolic act of defiance against thought suppression, end quote. In 1985, LaVey provided a definition of the deified Satanist. However, Flowers notes that LaVey himself often violated most of the characteristics that made up his own definition. According to Flowers, in 1986, LaVey redefined his form of Satanism as a conscious alternative to conventional and institutional thought. And last of all, my commentary. I was surprised to find out that LaVeyan Satanism wasn't at all what I thought it was, and it just goes to show that society often misperceives what it does not understand. It was obvious to me that those who accept the doctrines of the church and practice them do not sit around conjuring evil spirits and demons. I'm guessing that perception comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. After all, the word Satan means adversary or adversarial. The word itself does not connote an actual evil demonic being if you study the etymology of the term. I know that there are those who conjure up dark entities because in this world of dualism, in order for light to exist, dark must exist as well. There's nothing in the Satanic Bible, as far as I can tell, about conjuring up entities. Obviously, there are groups of people out there who do practice doing that, conjuring dark entities, just as there are groups of people who call themselves light workers, such as myself, who work with entities such as Archangels Michael, Gabriel, and Uriel and Raphael. Personally, my concern lies with the view of man and woman as just another animal that is pervasive in LaVeyan Satanism. When I look around at what is going on in the world today with all of the lust for power and control and greed, I conclude that we have, as Dr. Flowers contends in his book, that there is a powerful argument to be made that we are at present living in a satanic age. He doesn't make a judgment about whether this is a good or a bad thing, but in my eyes, it is not a good thing, because for me, life is about raising the consciousness of this world, about evolving spiritually as a human race. To each his or her own, but the satanic age, in my mind, represents the devolution of the human race instead of its evolution.